The seal was warm when they placed it in my hand, and that was the first thing that felt wrong about it. I had expected cold. I had expected the kind of ceremonial chill that matches the weight of a decision you never made. Instead, the metal had been sitting in sunlight through the viewport for an hour, and it felt almost gentle, almost kind, and I hated it for that. My name is Sella Vantrix, second daughter of Magistrate Owen Vantrix, and on the day our star began to die a little faster than the projections allowed, I was told I would be bonded to a human engineer to keep a dying accord from collapsing along with it. Our home system orbits a star we call Velosa. It had been stable for 11,000 years of recorded history. Then, 4 years before this story starts, it wasn't. The scientists used careful words like instability event and accelerated decay, but what they meant was that we had perhaps 2 generations before Velosa stopped being a place anyone could live near. Every other species with the technology to help us had their own problems, their own fears, their own reasons to look away. Only one species answered honestly, and it was the one none of our elders had ever taken seriously. Humans. They didn't offer fleets. They didn't offer soldiers. They offered engineers, technicians, and a station full of people who specialized, as far as any of our reports could tell, in fixing things that had already been declared unfixable. My father's advisors called it an insult before they called it a solution. "They're sending us their plumbers," one of them said at a council session I wasn't supposed to be in. Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because it was easier than admitting how frightened I was. The accord required a bond. Something visible, something that couldn't be quietly withdrawn if either side got nervous. A joining between one of ours and one of theirs, stationed together at Halcyon Reach, the relay platform where the technology transfer would actually happen. I was chosen because I was old enough to be taken seriously and young enough that the humans' engineers would have someone to answer to who wasn't already dying of stress. I met Owen Reyes in a small grey room with 2 cups of something the humans called coffee that I did not touch. He walked in wearing a plain grey jumpsuit with a tool belt still clipped to it, like he'd been called away from actual work to be here, which, I would learn, he had. He was unremarkable to look at. Medium height, dark hair cut short and uneven like he'd done it himself, hands that were scarred in the small, specific way of someone who worked with metal and heat rather than weapons. He didn't bow. He didn't perform gravity for the occasion. He just said, "Owen, sorry about the coffee, it's the station brew, it's terrible," and sat down across from me like we were about to discuss a shipping manifest. I gave him my full title. All of it. Every clan marker and rank suffix, because it was the only armor I had left in a room where I had no other power. He nodded once and said, "That's a lot of name. Mind if I just call you Sella?" I minded. I told him so. He said, "Okay," and didn't argue, and didn't look wounded, and didn't try to win me over. He just let the silence sit there between us for the rest of the hour, comfortable in it in a way that made me deeply uncomfortable in return. That was the first thing about him that didn't match what I'd been told to expect. My advisors had prepared me for arrogance, for the loud confidence every report described in human negotiators. What I got instead was a quiet man drinking bad coffee who seemed to feel no need to prove anything to me at all. The bonding itself was small and administrative. A station notary, 2 witnesses, a set of documents transferred between our 2 governments' legal registries. No music. No ceremony beyond the paperwork. We were given quarters near the station's engineering deck, 2 separate rooms, a shared common area, built for cohabitation and nothing warmer than that. Nobody expected warmth. The accord only needed the appearance of a bridge between our people, not an actual one. For the first weeks I treated him the way I treated the ventilation system. Present, necessary to my survival, and not worth thinking about beyond that. I spent my mornings drafting reports to my father about the star's decay curve and my evenings avoiding the man 3 meters down the hall. When we spoke, it was about schedules, ration allocations, the joint briefings where we had to stand near each other for the cameras. He never pushed. He never made me feel guilty for the distance. He cooked in our shared kitchen most nights, plain food, functional food, and he always made enough for 2, even after I told him not to bother. Some nights I found him sitting by the small viewport that looked out at Velosa's dimming light, not doing anything, just watching it the way you watch something you're keeping a private accounting of. I asked him once, coldly, why he'd taken this posting. I expected duty. I expected orders. He looked at the star for a long moment and said, "Somebody has to hold the door open long enough for the rest to get through. Doesn't have to be exciting work. Just has to get done." I didn't understand what he meant yet. I thought it was the kind of thing soldiers say to sound noble. I had no idea he had already held far more doors open than I could imagine, and that none of them had anything to do with me, not yet. The other Ithari on the station did not hide their opinions about the arrangement. At the shared mess hall, at the quarterly briefings, I heard the murmurs behind polite nods. A liaison from a species that still burns hydrocarbons for fuel in half their territory. A bond spent on a mechanic instead of an ally with real fleets. My own cousin, visiting on a supply run, told me quietly that at least he'd be easy to reassign later, as if that were a comfort. I won't pretend it didn't affect me. I had been raised to believe my worth was measured in the strength of my people's alliances. Bonded to a human engineer with no visible rank, no visible power, I felt something in my own importance had been quietly downgraded, and I carried that resentment everywhere, including into the small, undemanded moments where Owen asked nothing of me but company. But things kept not fitting the story I'd built about him. During a ration shortfall in our third month, a supply ship delayed by the same slow bureaucratic decay eating at everything else, I learned, secondhand, from a dock worker who mentioned it without any weight at all, that Owen had been quietly giving half his allocation to a group of Ithari maintenance apprentices who'd run short. He never told me. He never told anyone. It was only a passing comment from someone who assumed I already knew. Another time, a coolant line ruptured in an unpressurized section near the outer ring. Before the response team had even suited up, Owen was already in an emergency rig, moving alone through the breach to manually seal it before the pressure loss reached the crew quarters behind it. I watched the footage afterward with my hands not quite steady, and told myself it was only concern for station integrity. He never explained these things. He never asked to be noticed for them. It was as if helping people was simply the baseline setting he operated from, not something worth mentioning over dinner. I started watching him more closely after that, telling myself it was only curiosity about a strange colleague I happened to share quarters with. I noticed the way his eyes swept a room on entry, exits, hazards, load bearing points, before he let his shoulders relax into the posture that fooled everyone except, apparently, me. I noticed how his hands, so steady while cooking or reading a manual, went completely still during the station's emergency drills, like something in him switched from person to instrument. There were scars, too, old ones, visible only when his sleeves rode up during a maintenance shift. Not the kind you get from careless accidents. The kind you get from things nobody writes into an official file. I asked him once, carefully, what his life had been before this posting. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer at all. Then he said, I did some work a long time ago that isn't really dinner conversation, and left it there, the way he left most things unfinished. Something in me had already shifted without my permission. I no longer saw Owen Reyes as a lesser partner handed to me by circumstance. I saw him as a locked door I was slowly, unwillingly becoming curious enough to open. I had no idea yet that the quiet man cooking plain meals in our shared kitchen, the man who gave away his rations and sealed hull breaches without being asked twice, was going to become the only thing standing between Halcyon Reach and men who had already decided our dying star made us an easy target. The first real crack in the wall between us opened during a systems review, 5 months into the bond, when the station's chief engineer, a decorated woman named Elena Bright, who had run 3 deep space postings before this one, asked for a second opinion on a containment fault nobody could explain. Velos's decay had started throwing irregular flares, and the station's shielding array had begun failing in a pattern that made no sense against any known model. 3 Ithari physicists and 2 human engineers had spent a full rotation on it. I was there only because protocol required the bonded liaison to observe technical sessions that touched treaty operations, and I expected another hour of jargon I'd politely fail to follow. Bright called Owen in almost as an afterthought, the way you ask the person who happens to be standing nearby if they've got a spare tool. He looked at the readouts for less than 2 minutes. Then he pointed to a subsystem nobody had flagged, an old relay pattern, decades out of use, that the shielding software had apparently reactivated on its own as a fallback during the flare spikes. He didn't calculate out loud the way the others had. He just said, "It's not failing. It's improvising. Somebody built a failsafe into this thing a long time ago and forgot to tell the current documentation about it, and showed them exactly how to work with it instead of against it." The room went quiet. Bright looked at him the way you look at someone you'd underestimated on purpose, out of a kind of professional self-preservation. I asked him about it afterward, once we were alone in the transit car back to our quarters. I asked how a station mechanic knew shielding architecture well enough to correct 3 physicists in under 2 minutes. He gave me a small, tired smile. I used to do this kind of thing for a living, before I did this instead, he said, gesturing vaguely between us, meaning the bond, meaning the quiet posting, meaning the ordinary life we were both pretending to build out of spare parts. I wanted to ask more. I always wanted to ask more, after that. But something in his eyes told me the answer would cost him more than I was ready to understand, so I let the silence sit, the way I'd let so many silences sit before. Small pieces of his past kept surfacing anyway. I noticed how certain human staff treated him with a formal distance that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite caution, but something close to both. I noticed that his personnel file, which I could access through liaison privilege, had entire sections marked restricted even to treaty allies. One evening, a young human logistics officer named Doran was Ithari, one of our own dock workers who'd become something like a friend over shared meals, mentioned, almost carelessly, that he was surprised Bright let Owen anywhere near shielding architecture given the ashfall thing. I asked what that meant. Doran's face shifted immediately, the ease draining out of it. He apologized, said it wasn't his place, and changed the subject. That night I searched what records I could reach for any mention of an ashfall event in human history. Most of what I found was old, thin, and carefully unspecific, a period, roughly a human generation back, when a cascading failure in Earth's own power and logistics networks had come within what one surviving document called single-digit weeks of ending industrial civilization on their homeworld entirely. There was a designation buried in one older technical appendix, Rebuild Corps, described only as a small specialized group credited with turning total systemic collapse into a stabilized recovery. I read that appendix more times than I want to admit, looking for any thread connecting a decades-old human crisis response unit to the quiet man asleep 3 meters down the hall. I found no direct proof that night, but something in my chest already knew. I confronted him 3 days later, sitting across from him at our small kitchen table, unable to hold the question in any longer. I asked if he'd been part of the Rebuild Corps during ashfall. He set his cup down slowly. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I was one of the last ones still standing when it was over, he said, and left it there, the way he left most things unfinished, like saying more would crack something he'd spent years carefully repairing. I didn't push that night, but the questions kept multiplying. If this quiet man, handed to me as a diplomatic formality, had once been part of a team that pulled an entire civilization back from total collapse, what exactly had humanity sent us, wrapped in the shape of an ordinary station mechanic? I started watching how he moved through Halcyon Reach differently after that, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense that he wasn't simply undervalued by circumstance. He was deliberately underestimated, and I began to suspect some of that was his own doing. 2 weeks later, a sensor fault triggered a false alarm indicating an unregistered vessel had breached the outer perimeter. Sirens, officers running to stations, my own pulse hammering even as I told myself it was probably nothing. Owen was reading on the couch when the alarm sounded. He didn't jump. He checked a small wrist device I'd never noticed before and said, "Sensor drift on the outer relay, it'll clear in 10 minutes, and went back to his page. It cleared in 9. I asked how he knew. He shrugged. You learn to read the shape of an alarm before you learn to be afraid of it. Another half-explained truth that told me more about his past than any restricted file could. Around this time, I stopped seeing Owen as a burden I'd been forced to accept, and started seeing him as a person I genuinely wanted to understand. I lingered longer over shared meals. I asked questions out of real curiosity instead of obligation. I noticed the way he hummed under his breath while fixing something, the strangely gentle way he handled the station's stray maintenance cat, the patience he showed with the Ithari apprentice engineers who still flinched a little around humans out of old habit. He began opening up in small stories, offered without pressure. He told me about a woman named Iris Calloway, a friend from the Rebuild Corps who'd taught him to stay steady under pressure by focusing on one solvable problem at a time instead of the whole collapsing picture. He told me about losing people during ashfall, colleagues, not soldiers, engineers who died keeping systems running for people who never knew their names. He never gave me full details. Each fragment felt like a small crack of light into a room that had been sealed for years. One evening on the narrow observation deck, watching Velos's dimming light through the reinforced glass, I asked him directly why he'd taken this posting after everything he'd apparently survived. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, I spent years keeping things from falling apart so other people wouldn't have to know how close they came. This felt like the same job, just quieter. And this time there's somebody sitting next to me instead of a whole planet waiting on the other end of a radio. I didn't have a response to that. I sat beside him in the dim station light, watching a star neither of us fully understood, and felt something in my chest shift permanently, resentment giving way to something far more complicated. Something dangerously close to respect. And, though I wasn't ready to admit it yet, something even closer to care. I did not know how soon that quiet peace would be tested. The Rill Combine had been a rumor for years before they became a fact. A loose alliance of salvage crews and failed state raiders who made a living picking through dying systems for whatever technology the owners couldn't defend anymore. Vel-Os's collapse had put us on their maps the moment our shielding failures became public knowledge in the treaty registries. Scavengers read desperation the way engineers read stress fractures. Their first probe came disguised as a supply transport requesting docking rights. Bright's team flagged inconsistencies in the ship's registry within minutes, mismatched engine signatures, a crew manifest that didn't match the voice patterns on the docking channel. Owen was in the command deck for an unrelated maintenance briefing when the flags came up. He looked at the approach vector for a few seconds and said, quietly, "That's not a supply ship. That's a scout, checking our response time," and recommended we let it dock, watch it, and let it leave thinking we hadn't noticed. We did. It left. 3 days later, sensors caught it rendezvousing with 4 other unregistered vessels at the edge of the system. I remember how calm Owen was through all of it, and how that calm unsettled me more than panic would have. He spent that week walking the station's lower maintenance corridors with Bright's engineering staff, quietly rerouting power conduits, relabeling junction access panels, moving spare hull plating into positions that looked accidental and weren't. Nobody asked him to. He simply did it, the way he did most things, without explanation, without asking for recognition. I asked him what he was preparing for. He said, "Best case, nothing. Worst case, I'd rather this station be a bad place for someone to fight in than a good one." I didn't fully understand what he meant until the day the Combine stopped pretending to be a supply ship. The attack came on an ordinary morning. Pale light through the viewport, the smell of the terrible station coffee Owen made anyway, the small comfort of routine that made the alarm feel, for one suspended second, like a mistake that would correct itself. It didn't correct itself. The station-wide broadcast cut through every channel. Unregistered fleet signatures at the outer marker, all non-essential personnel to shelter. This is not a drill. I froze at the kitchen table. Owen didn't. He set his cup down with the same steady precision he used for everything, walked to a panel near our door I'd never seen him open, and pulled out a compact case holding equipment far more serious than anything a station mechanic should have needed. He checked it with quick, practiced movements. I asked him what was happening. He looked at me, and for the first time since the bond began, I saw something shift behind his eyes. Not fear, but a focus so absolute it startled me more than the sirens did. "Rill Combine, 5 ships, coming in fast," he said. "Get to shelter, Sella." He'd never used my name with that particular urgency before. It cut through me faster than any alarm. I told him I would go to shelter. I did not go to shelter. Instead, I used my liaison access to reach the station's upper observation gallery, my hand shaking the whole way, every distant tremor through the hull reminding me how real this was. From the gallery, I finally saw them. 5 scavenger vessels, mismatched and ugly but heavily armed, moving in the loose predatory formation of crews who'd done this before and expected an easy target. The station's defense grid, thin and mostly ceremonial, powered up anyway, human and Ithari crews scrambling to coordinate a response that looked, even to my untrained eye, badly outmatched. Boarding pods broke from the lead ship and struck the outer docking ring, exactly where the civilian quarters and the apprentice engineering dorms were located. I searched the chaos below for Owen, my chest tight with something I refused to name as anything but concern for the treaty. Then I saw him. He moved into the breached section alone, without armor, in the same plain jumpsuit from breakfast, carrying only a sidearm and the compact case slung across his shoulder. He was not running toward shelter. He was running directly toward the boarding party as they cut through the ring. I wanted to scream through the glass separating us, to somehow make him hear me, to tell him one man couldn't stand against armed raiders in a station never built to be defended. My voice caught in my throat as the first scavengers emerged from the breach, moving with the loud confidence of people who had never once needed to be careful. Owen reached the breach exactly as the lead squad advanced toward a group of Ithari apprentices trapped near a collapsed supply locker. I watched him take in the scene in less than a second. The same quiet focus I'd seen over 100 shared meals now turned into something colder, faster, absolute. He didn't meet them head-on. He used a support strut from the collapsed locker as cover and disabled the lead raider's weapon with a single shot to its power cell before the squad had even registered him as a threat worth reacting to. In the confusion, he closed distance through the narrow corridor faster than I thought possible, using the tight maintenance space to keep their numbers from ever mattering. Within seconds, the squad that had been advancing on defenseless apprentices was scattered and disarmed, without a single life lost on either side. I stood frozen at the gallery glass, hands pressed to the cold surface, watching my bonded partner move through an active boarding action with a calm efficiency that unmade everything I thought I understood about him. More pods breached as the raid pushed deeper, and Owen moved from encounter to encounter with the same unsettling precision, gathering fleeing crew and apprentices and directing them towards safer corridors even while engaging the raiders pressing in behind them. He used the station itself as a weapon, collapsing a weakened bulkhead to slow one squad, rerouting a maintenance drone to jam their short-range comms, turning every disadvantage of an underdefended relay platform into a tool against the people trying to take it. I finally understood, watching him, what those weeks of quiet rewiring and relabeled panels had actually been for. He hadn't been preparing the station to survive an attack. He'd been preparing it to fight back. A second, larger wave pushed toward the command deck, where Bright and the treaty negotiators were sheltering, and where I now realized my father's own envoy staff had been temporarily stationed for the technology transfer review. I made a decision I know, in hindsight, was reckless past reason. I left the gallery and used every override my title still granted me to reach the command corridor ahead of the raiders, telling myself it was to warn the envoy staff. In truth, some deeper part of me simply needed to see, up close, exactly who I had bonded myself to. The corridor outside command was chaos, crew running, officers shouting coordinates, the growing thunder of a larger raiding party advancing with disciplined, practiced patience. I counted at least 30 armed scavengers, backed by 2 heavy breaching units and a command runner directing them from the rear. Against them stood a handful of exhausted station security officers, a thin human tactical team, and Owen, still in the same plain jumpsuit, a shallow cut along his forearm the only visible mark of what he'd already survived that morning. The Combine's lead runner broadcast a demand for immediate surrender of the reactor core, promising to leave the crew alive if the station stood down. Owen stepped forward, alone, ahead of the thin line, and answered with something almost gentle. "You really don't want to do this on my side of the station." The runner laughed and gave the order to advance. What happened over the next several minutes rewired everything I understood about the man I'd bonded to, and about the species my father's advisors had once dismissed as glorified plumbers. Owen didn't meet the advancing wave with force. He met it with the station itself. He drew the breaching units into a narrow service corridor he'd quietly reinforced weeks earlier, then triggered a controlled collapse that separated them from the rest of the wave entirely. Isolated, the heavy units became vulnerable in ways their armor was never designed to handle, a weakness in their power coupling that Owen exploited with the same calm precision he used to fix a coolant line, a weakness I would later learn came directly from lessons paid for in Earth's own hardest years. The remaining raiders, reduced and disoriented by losses that made no sense against one defender, fell back toward their command runner in something close to a rout. The runner made one last desperate call for a concentrated final push. Owen braced against a support column near command's entrance, blood now visible along his side, breathing controlled despite the exhaustion showing in every line of his posture. For one terrible moment I thought this final wave might be the one that finally overwhelmed him. Then I understood what every previous engagement had actually been building toward. He hadn't just been fighting. He'd been herding, funneling the wave, engagement by engagement, toward a single reinforced junction near the reactor access point, rigged during his very first pass through the corridor that morning. As the final assault converged, he triggered it, not enough to seriously harm anyone converging on it, but more than enough to disable their equipment and scatter their coordination at the one moment unity mattered most. What followed wasn't really a battle anymore. It was Owen moving through disoriented raiders with the same unhurried precision he'd shown from the first breach, disabling equipment, ending resistance not through overwhelming force but through absolute control of every variable the Combine never realized was being managed against them from the very start. The runner, watching the wave collapse, tried a final retreat. Owen reached the command runner before its drive came fully online and disabled its controls with the same technical care he used on a failing relay. The runner emerged with hands raised, all its earlier confidence gone, replaced by something that looked, even across the distance, like genuine fear. I watched Owen speak to it briefly, too far to hear the words, and watched the runner nod, agreeing to whatever terms were offered. Station security arrived in force to secure the surrender, the engagement having lasted less time than one of our quiet shared breakfasts. I stayed hidden near the collapsed locker long after the fighting ended, shaking not from fear anymore but from the weight of what I'd just watched. A man I had spent months quietly resenting for being an inadequate substitute for a real ally had, alone, dismantled a raiding force that should have taken this station within the hour. Owen found me a few minutes later, his expression shifting from exhausted calm to something close to alarm the moment he realized how close I'd actually been to the fighting. He crossed the corridor quickly, checking me for injuries with the same care he'd used to assess the battlefield. "Why weren't you in shelter, Sella?" His voice wasn't angry. It carried something closer to fear, not for himself. I told him the truth instead of a diplomatic excuse. I told him I needed to see, with my own eyes, exactly who I had bonded myself to. He looked at me for a long moment, blood still visible along his side, and said, quietly, almost like an apology, "Now you have. I'm sorry you had to see it this way." I didn't understand yet why he was apologizing for saving an entire deck of Ithari and human lives. I would understand soon. The hours after blurred into a strange mixture of chaos and quiet disbelief. Medical teams moved through the corridors treating minor wounds. Security processed the surrendered raiders into holding. Engineers began cataloging what needed repair and what needed to be rebuilt entirely. I stayed close to Owen through most of it, partly for the wound along his side, which the medics finally treated at a temporary station near the collapsed locker, and partly because I no longer wanted the distance I had once insisted on keeping between us. My father's own reinforcement escort arrived a full day later than projected, delayed by the same slow supply disputes that had cost us so much already. When Magistrate Owen Vantrix finally reached Halcyon Reach, he found not a station reduced to wreckage and forced concessions, but a secured deck, a captured combined wave held for processing, and a treaty still fully intact, protected not by fleets or soldiers, but by one human engineer nearly everyone in his court had dismissed weeks earlier as an unremarkable liaison. I watched my father's careful diplomatic neutrality slowly give way to something closer to genuine shock as Bright walked him through the surveillance record. He asked twice for confirmation, as if the account, 1 engineer against 30 armed raiders and 2 heavy units, simply couldn't be accurate. The footage confirmed it both times. Afterward, my father requested a private conversation with Owen. I insisted on being present, partly out of duty, mostly because I refused to be excluded from a conversation about the man I had spent months slowly, unwillingly, coming to love. My father opened with the practiced gratitude of official proceedings, but I could see genuine confusion underneath it. He asked how a single station mechanic had managed what an entire defense grid should have struggled to accomplish. Owen considered the question for a long moment. Then he told my father, and by extension told me, more than he'd ever offered before, about Ashfall, about the rebuild core, about a collapse that had come within weeks of ending industrial civilization on his own homeworld a generation earlier. He explained that the peace his people offered us hadn't come from casual generosity. It had come from humanity's own hard-earned understanding of exactly how close total collapse can come, and exactly what it takes to hold a system together with nothing but scavenged parts and stubborn will. Lessons written not in official archives, he said, but in the memory of the people who survived long enough to carry them forward. He told my father plainly, I didn't take this posting to be a symbol. I took it because I understood, better than most people here, exactly how fast a fragile system can fail, and I wanted to be standing close enough when this one got tested. The room went quiet. My father, rarely at a loss for words, simply nodded, processing the weight of it. Something in my chest settled permanently that day. I had believed for months that my people had been handed a lesser ally, dressed up in a treaty to spare humanity the cost of an outright refusal. I understood now that the opposite was true. Humanity hadn't sent us their weakest option. They had sent us someone who already understood, in his bones, exactly what it costs to keep a dying system alive, and had chosen, deliberately, to spend that understanding protecting people who weren't even his own. Alone with him later, at our small kitchen table, I asked why he'd never told me any of this sooner, why he'd let me believe for months he was simply an ordinary man handed to me as political weight. He was quiet, looking at the 2 cold cups of coffee between us. He said he hadn't wanted me to see him as a tool before I had the chance to see him as a person. After Ashfall, After losing colleagues who'd never asked to be remembered, he'd made himself a quiet promise. If he ever got something like an ordinary life again, he wouldn't let what he'd survived define every relationship he tried to build afterward. Letting me know him slowly, as someone who cooked plain food and gave away his rations and fixed things without being asked, had been the first real attempt he'd made in years to be seen as more than what he was trained to do. I told him, as honestly as I could, that seeing what he was capable of hadn't diminished the man I'd come to care about. If anything, understanding the full weight of what he carried made me respect him more than I had ever respected anyone. I hadn't bonded to a diplomatic formality, and I hadn't bonded to a weapon. I had bonded to a man who chose, again and again, to keep things from breaking, and who only became something dangerous when every gentler option had already run out. In the weeks that followed, Halcyon Reach slowly returned to something like ordinary life, though nothing about our bond stayed quite the way it had been. My father's court, humbled by exactly how close we'd come to losing everything and by exactly what had saved us, began treating the human accord with a seriousness that had been noticeably absent before. Word eventually reached us that the failed raid had cost the Rill Combine's leadership badly among their own rival crews, opening space for quieter, more cautious factions to take their place. I started sitting in on Owen's remaining technical briefings, not out of obligation but genuine partnership, learning alongside him as we worked to stabilize what the Accord was actually supposed to protect. I learned that Iris Calloway, the old Rebuild Corps colleague he'd mentioned on the observation deck, had survived Ashfall after all, reassigned years before its final, worst weeks, and Owen slowly began reconnecting with people he'd kept carefully at a distance since then. Our evenings at the viewport continued, though they felt different now, less like two strangers cautiously sharing space, more like two people who finally understood what they meant to each other. I no longer saw the stillness in his eyes during drills as an unsettling mystery. I understood it now as the visible edge of a discipline built out of loss, chosen again and again in service of holding things together rather than tearing them apart. My father, addressing the full council weeks later, said plainly that our survival didn't rest on the size of anyone's fleet, but on the character of people willing to carry an unglamorous burden quietly, without needing to be seen for it. I sat in that chamber and thought back to the grey room where I'd first met Owen, holding a coffee I never touched, certain I'd been handed the lesser end of a desperate bargain. I understood now how wrong I had been. I hadn't bonded to a downgrade. I had bonded to a man who had already rebuilt one collapsing world before, and who chose to spend what that cost him keeping a second one standing, quietly, without asking anyone to notice, until the moment noticing was the only thing left to do. By the time we understood what he'd actually survived to become the man drinking bad coffee in our kitchen, it was already far too late to change our minds about him. And standing beside him at the viewport, watching Vel Ossa's light steady itself for the first time in years, I found I didn't want to.